Welcome to the tutorial for the climate scenario model. With the scenario model, you can project the world's energy system and calculate consequences in the form of CO2 emissions and temperature changes. The model consists of a number of key figures that must be filled in. The model ensures that the energy system will always be in balance regardless of which key figures you insert. You therefore do not need to have knowledge of the connections in the energy system to use the model. If you are interested in how the key figures are defined, you can watch the video, The Structure in the Climate Scenario Model. This tutorial starts with us going into the Excel sheet that contains the scenario model. Now I'm inside the Excel sheet that contains the climate scenario model. As a user, the first thing you can have to decide is the level of detail you want to use when projecting the world's energy system. You can choose to count on the world as a whole. Here is the bright green. You can choose to count on the world divided in OECD countries and non-OECD countries. It's the green. And you can choose to count on the world divided in 9 areas. It's the dark green. You make your choice by going to the corresponding tabs here. So if you, for instance, choose to count on the world as a whole, you choose this bright green here. And if you choose to count on the world as divided in OECD and non-OECD, you choose the green tabs here. And if you would calculate on the world divided in 9 areas, you choose the dark green. You fill in the key figures for the energy system in the KF tabs here. And you see the results in the temperature tabs here. The first important parameter you must determine is the final consumption in the area you are counting on. You can estimate the development in the population and in the energy consumption per capita here, and hereby determine the energy consumption. You can also use the gross domestic product here, or you can use the Human Development Index in order to do it, or the Social Progress Index here. The most important thing is that you can give a good explanation of how you arrive at the figure you fill in for the energy consumption that you enter in the model. These figures here. In this video, I will focus on the world as a whole. So I click here on the world, and as you can see here, we have we have the total CO2 emissions historically here, and how they will be in the future based on the key figures we have filled in here. And this here is the final consumption. You can see here how the final consumption has developed through the years. And now you had to put in values here for year 2030 and in year 2050. If I, for instance, say that I believe that there will be an increase in the world consumption here, and set this here, then you have to look here at the value of the CO2 emissions here. And you can see that in this case, the CO2 emissions will increase. So if we just become more inhabitants on the planet and we have the same energy system as we have today, then the CO2 emissions will increase. Now I'll go back here to the original value. The next thing you have to fill in here is the distribution of this total energy consumption here between the different sectors. And here, if you, for instance, assume here that there will be an increase in the energy use in the transport sector, you put a new value in here, for instance, 45 here, and then automatically this value for residential will decrease. If you think that it is in fact in the industry that there will be a reduction, then you put a value of, for instance, 25 here percent, and then you will have a higher value here. The cells with this red color here, you don't have to fill in because they will secure that the total here will be 100%. When you have decided on the distribution between the different sectors here, you continue by putting values for the distribution between the different energy forms here for industry, this here, and for the transport sector. If you, for instance, assume that there will be more electric vehicles here, you increase this value to, for instance, 10% here, and then there will be automatically a reduction in the oil-based transport fuels. You continue here with the residential, with the commercial and public service, and forestry and agriculture sector, fishing sector, not specified sector. And when you have done that, you have in fact defined the total end consumption in the world. After that, you fill in this here, which is the transport losses in the electricity grid and the transport losses in district heating. So you put percentage for these losses here. When you've done that, you have to fill in this here, which says that in the conversion sector, there is also an energy use, and here you say how much this energy use in the conversion sector, own use in the conversion sector, should be related to the total final energy use. After we have done that, you define distribution between the different energy forms here in the energy sector. Now you have to define how much heat should be produced on CHP plants, combined heat and power plants, and how much heat should be produced on heat-only plants. When you've done that here, you fill in the how much of the heat production that should be based on electricity. This is this figure here. And then you fill in here the CM value, the relationship between electricity production and heat production on the combined heat and power plants. And you say here that 100% here of the oil products, they will be produced on oil refineries. Now you will define the distribution of electricity production on the electricity-only plants. How much should be produced on hydro plants? How much should be produced on geothermal, solar and wind? And how much should be produced on fuel-based plants here? When you've done that, you do the same here for CSP plants and for heat plants. There's no CSP plants running on hydro, and there's no heat-only plants running on hydro, so you need not fill in for hydro here. The next thing you fill in here is the efficiency of the different power technologies. This you fill in here, and then for the electricity only plants that are based on fuel. You fill in here the distribution between the different kinds of fuels here. You do in fact the same here for combined heat and power plants and for the heat only plants here. And then for the oil refineries, you say how much of the oil will come from crude oil, how much will be based on biofuels and waste here. When you've done that, you fill in how much flue gas cleaning will there be on each of these different technologies. So if you, for instance, assume here that 10% of all the coal-fired unit will be equipped with CO2 cleaning units, and you put a 10% value here, and of course then you can see here the CO2 will be reduced. And finally, this here is the efficiency factors for in the end use sector here. When you have filled out all these here, you can go up here and see the corresponding CO2 emissions. We now shift here to the temperature tab, and here in this tab here, you can see the CO2 emissions in tons, million tons here for year 2018, and how much it will be in year 2030 and 50 based on the key values you have put into the Excel sheet. And then you have to uh, extrapolate these values here yourself to year 2075 and year 2100. So these factors you have to put in yourself here. These factors here is only the CO2 emissions within the energy sector, but there is also emissions of greenhouse gases in the other sectors here, and therefore you also have to fill in this key figure here, which explains how much of the total emission that will come from the energy sector. If you say here, I assume here that 74% of the total emissions will come from energy sector, then the total emissions will be this amount here. If I increase this here to 74, for instance here, then this value here will reduce, because then 74% will come from the energy sector instead of 50%. In this figure here, you can see this is the Paris target here, and this here is a figure for your scenario. And you can see here in your scenario, you will have a higher CO2 emissions than it is the Paris target. The way these temperatures are calculated is shown here. You need not change these figures here. I will just explain to you how these figures are calculated. If you are going to calculate temperature changes, you need to know how much the carbon concentration in the atmosphere will change in the future. Here you have the concentration of carbon to the time 10t, and here you have the concentration of carbon to the time n. So we are going from time n to time t. In this time period, we will emit this CE amount of carbon per year as an average, and then we multiply this with the number of years between n and t here, and we multiply it with this factor here. This factor shows that we assume that 45% of the carbon emitted will stay in the atmosphere, we divide this with this factor here, which change carbon to carbon concentration in the atmosphere. And then we multiply it with this here that shows that some of the concentration, some of the carbon in the atmosphere will transfer to the oceans. So based on this formula, we can find the concentration of carbon in the future if we know how much will be emitted of carbon year by year. The next formula here is also from the very simple climate model, and it shows how temperature will change. Here we have the temperature at the time n, and we want to know the temperature to time t. And this value S is the temperature sensitivity. So if we here, for instance, assume that the concentration will be doubled here, then we have log 2 to the double to 2 here, and this is 1. So when we double the concentration of carbon in the atmosphere, then the temperature will rise with this S value. The S value here is typically between 3 and 4.5. These two formulas is implemented in the climate scenario model. Now I'm back in the model. And as you can see here, we assume here that the concentration in year 2015 is this value here. We also assume that the temperature in year 2015, the global temperature was 14.65, and we assume here that the climate sensitivity is 3. As a user, you can change that value here, and the carbon emission in year 2015 was this amount here. This is the carbon emissions, how that will develop in the future based on your scenario calculations. And based on these emissions here, the model will calculate the concentration. And as you can see here, this is in fact the formula for the concentration in the future, this value here up here. And when we know the concentration in the future, we also able to calculate the temperature. And this temperature calculation is based on this formula here, which is also the formula I showed you, and the formula that will come from the very simple climate model. But as a user, you only have to decide on whether you will change this value here, the climate sensitivity. And then you can, when you do your scenario calculations, you can see here how the temperature will increase. And you need to have a temperature that is below this here if you will be able to fulfill the Paris target. If you decide on calculating on the world divided in OECD and non-OECD countries, you have to fill in these two tabs here. The tabs, they are the same here. There's no difference between the tabs here and the tabs for the whole world, but here you have to, the world is divided in these two areas here. You can also from the platform download another version of the climate scenario model where we have hidden all the sectors here that has a very low influence on the results. And we have done that the same here for all the different energy forms here that are unimportant here. This version of the climate scenario model is more easy to work with. This here was the tutorial for the climate scenario model, and I hope that you will just go in and play with the model.